Hello and welcome to this special 1960s makeup masterclass. So in this masterclass we are going to be exploring some of the makeup techniques that we can use to create some gorgeous, glamorous 1960s makeup looks. This masterclass is going to be split into two sections. The first one is going to be theory, which is what we're going to be discussing now. And in the second one, we're going to be doing some practical. So we're going to look at the practical tips and tricks for creating a 1960s makeup. But first, before we do that, I really want to add some context to the makeup look itself by delving in a little bit to the 1960s and what it was all about. So this just gives us an opportunity to explore the things that were happening that informed makeup at the time, the fashion, the kind of cultural elements. So we're going to jump right into that now. So the 1960s, also known as the swinging 60s, was called that because it really was a time of kind of high energy, bright colours, exploration, creative ideas and creative thinking. So it was really a shift in sort of cultural norms. We're going to look at some of the kind of key events that happened in the 1960s first. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, there is absolutely tons of them. And if you go away and do some of your own research on the 1960s, you will find that a lot of really significant things happened in kind of world politics and just kind of in culture in general. But I've picked a couple out that I think give you an idea of just kind of the magnitude of the shift at the time. So let's look at music first. So in the 1960s saw the Beatles release their first single in the United Kingdom. So that really was the start of some big changes in music culture. And really that whole decade saw lots of new genres of music coming about with lots of like punk rock and just a kind of shift towards experimentation with music and experimentation with art as well. Think about pop art, your Andy Warhol artists, people like that. There was an awful lot of experimentation, particularly with colour at the time. We also had big changes in politics and the rise of a more active youth scene really brought about kind of global awareness of various different issues taking place culturally, and we saw lots more protests and lots more activity of that nature. Martin Luther King Jr. led a peaceful civil rights march from Selma to Montgomery at this time, and I think that one of the things that we notice about this period is that there is quite a lot of cultural changes around things like racial inequality and even the rise of feminism around this time as well. Fashion saw some pretty major changes. The decade that had gone before, so the 50s, if you think about 50s fashion, long pleated skirts, very sort of exaggerated feminine shapes in women's fashion, well, the 1960s really took that, tore it up and thought of it in a totally new way. You had designers like Mary Quant who designed the mini skirt, and that just really blew up. Now, in regard to fashion at this time, London was really kind of leading the charge, and there was a real push towards experimental fashion. So instead of those kind of cuts and pleats, we were very A-line, shift dresses, long boots, short skirts, colour and sort of patterns, floral patterns, and again, lots and lots of experimentation. Just to bring it back to music a little bit, Rolling Stone published its first magazine during this decade. So again, the real shift towards music culture. And from the point of view of development in science, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to arrive on the moon in the Apollo 11 mission. So this was a decade of big things, big events, big changes, and lots of kind of pushes into the modern world. And that really reflected and kind of boiled down into lots and lots of things that were happening in society, and makeup and fashion being one of them. So just to look a little bit more at the history of the time, so if we think about the 50s in black and white, then the 60s are in glorious Technicolor. When the Second World War came to an end, it created new opportunities and freedoms, and there was suddenly, I think in this decade, it would appear there was more hope and a lot more optimism, and a lot of that was because we had a generation of young people that were growing up that were free from conscription, so they weren't going to be worried about being signed up in the army or having to worry about things like rationing and things like that. So that gave them a sense of freedom, and this was also the first time that the youth generation, so the people in between the working adults and the teenagers, so those guys in the middle, this was the first time that they had jobs for themselves, were earning passive income, and were earning an income that they could go and spend on frivolous things like music and fashion, and that really dictated a lot of what was happening at the time. Young people for the first time in this decade were really given a voice, and the parents of the 60s teenage generation had spent their youth fighting in the Second World War, so the way they raised their children really altered from how their parents had raised them, because they'd had a very significantly different experience. By the early 1960s, teenagers were already significantly different from those in the decade previous, and as a result, that really changes culture as a whole. Okay, it has a big impact on what's going on in the wider field. Now, before we talk about makeup, I think it's really important that we talk about fashion. Fashion obviously informs everything else that we do with our look. Really, I would say that fashion changes first, and then the makeup tends to change in line with that. So let's have a little look at fashion first. So women's 1960s fashion was extreme style and attitude from the start of the decade to the end. And in the early years, you had fashion idols like Jackie Kennedy, who were very much the sort of all-American. It was very, demure and put together and very kind of safe and kind of, it was kind of the extension of the 50s, the American 50s housewife. So that was at the start of the 1960s. But really, by the middle to the sort of end of the decade, you started seeing the rise of the supermodel like Twiggy, and we had Mary Quant, who popularised, if you remember we said previously, the short, straight, block, bold styles. The 1960s was an important decade for fashion. It was the first time in history that clothing was geared towards the youth market. We're going to keep talking about that because it's important. So it was the first time that these clothes weren't clothes for the housewife, they were clothes for the young, free, energetic, enthused, creative people, and that really, I think, is reflected in the types of styles as well. Very much considered to be a decade that reshaped fashion and kind of shook the rules up, and I think we see that in makeup as well. So let's talk now a little bit about makeup and hair. So again, very youth-led, and I think that we can say that, again, a bit like the clothing, the hair and the makeup styles were split into two very specific categories. So the youth was having a big impact. The 1950s makeup and hair look was still kind of in the early part of the decade teetering over. So we still had those very shaped hairstyles with the pink lips and the very demure looks. But then we started to get that sort of creep in of the kind of colour block, the fun, the Technicolor. So women's 1960s makeup began very demure with the pastels and the nudes that enhanced the natural beauty. And again, that was the Jackie Kennedy effect. And hair at the time was quite bouffant. We had lots of pillar box hats. It was natural, but just kind of amplified, if that makes sense, with colour and with height and with shape. The other side of that coin, of course, is the much more emboldened Technicolor. So on the other side of that spectrum, and again originating really from the London fashion scene, was the edgy, the rebellious, the mod subculture. So this is the short hair, these kinds of pixie crop cuts, which, let's face it, have never gone out of fashion. Loads and loads of thick, dark mascara, plenty of eyeshadow with colour. Sometimes it was monochrome, so we were looking at lots and lots of blacks and whites, that kind of thing. And this is really where we started to see things like shapes on the eye and kind of using line work and geometry. So this is where we started to see the cut creases. The pencil liner wasn't about enhancing the eye, it was about colouring and drawing and shaping and just creating these kind of more rounded, new, fun shapes. The sort of key standout things we want to think about here would be things like the thick black liquid eyeliner, lots of very heavy doll-like lashes were a big thing at this time, again never really gone away. Also bottom lashes became a bit of a thing, which isn't something that we'd really seen in the previous decade, and also just like kind of heavy eye looks and heavy colour, lots of block colour, which again is reflected, I think, in the fashions itself. Now, one good way of researching the makeup looks at the time is to actually look at some cosmetic adverts from the period itself. And what's great about these is we can see just how fun the makeup is. I mean, in the first ad we can see here, the iTalk ad, I mean, this is colour, this is shape. You've got eyeshadow that goes all the way up to the brow, lots of geometric lines and even some little gems being added in there. The brows are quite shaped and quite drawn in, and that is something that was seen really throughout the whole decade. It wasn't so much about a soft brow, it was about creating more geometry, more lines. Very, very doughy eyes, so eyes tend to be quite heavy and doughy with lots and lots of product on. Lips a little bit more subtle, your kind of pinks and peaches, a little bit of red, but I would say a little bit more sheer with more things happening on the eye. And also these looks are quite matte in texture, so the matte texture was very much the thing. There's not really much discussion when we look at cosmetic ads about glow or highlight or anything like that. It's very much your face, your powder, matte lip with some colour, and then the eye is these block colours creating loads and loads of shape. And there's a lot of offsetting of colours, so we're seeing a lot of adding white to offset some lighter colours and then black to offset those colours. So it's like having something for the colours to bounce around and to bounce off. Again, very reflective of the fashion at the time. So this is the sort of makeup that we are going to be recreating in the practical part of our session. If you want to continue reading about any of this stuff, it's all available for you in the references, and I would definitely recommend that you take some time to learn a little bit more about the 1960s to get a really in-depth understanding of kind of how these makeup looks came about. But for now, I think that's enough for now for us to jump in to the next part of our session.